A little girl and her mama were left to die on the trail, until the lonely rancher rode up and said, "You're coming home with me." Wyoming Territory, late autumn, 1883. The trail stretched like a pale scar across the sagebrush plains, and the wind carried grit out of the red gullies until the sun looked like a tarnished coin. Luke McGraw rode alone, hat brim low, scarf pulled high over his mouth. The creak of leather and the steady breath of his bay gelding were the only sounds besides the rasp of the storm. The land smelled of dust and juniper, and somewhere behind the wind, winter was sharpening its teeth. He had been riding for hours without thought, the way men do when they have learned to build a quiet inside themselves. Then a sound broke the monotony, faint, tremulous, and out of place. It was not the moan of wind through rock or the cry of a hawk. It was the high, stubborn wail of a child. Luke reined in sharply, his eyes narrowing against the dust. He held still, listening. The cry came again, carried thin through the wind. "Easy, boy," he murmured to the horse, then turned the gelding toward a low rise, where the trail dipped into a shallow wash. At the crest, he saw it, a wagon on its side, one wheel still spinning with a lazy squeal. The trail was littered with spilled supplies. A split sack of flour bleeding white into the dirt, a cracked lantern, scraps of fabric. Behind the wagon, crouched low as if the boards might shield them from the wind, were a woman and a little girl. The woman's dress bore a dark stain at her hip, too dry to be fresh, but deep enough to speak of pain. She clutched the girl so tightly it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. Luke swung down from the saddle, boots hitting the ground with a dull thud. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over them. "Who did this?" His voice was low, but it carried an edge sharpened by habit. "And why'd they leave you alive?" The woman lifted her head. Her eyes were wary, guarded, and there was something in them that spoke of calculation as much as fear. "We were traveling," she said, voice soft but steady. "We fell behind. The others, they didn't wait." She shifted her hold on the girl, as if pulling her farther from his gaze. "That blood says otherwise," Luke replied, eyes fixed on the stain. He searched her face for a flicker of truth, but she offered nothing more. The girl, perhaps 5 years old, peered at him from the shelter of her mother's arm. Her cheeks were streaked with dust, eyes too big for her small, pinched face. She said nothing, but Luke caught the quick way her fingers curled tighter into her mother's dress. His gaze lingered on them for a beat longer, and then he crouched. "Name?" "Evelyn Parker," she said after a pause. "This is my daughter, Rose." Luke gave a short nod, then rose to his full height. Without asking, he bent and slid an arm beneath the child, lifting her with an ease that spoke of years around skittish colts and injured calves. Rose's small body stiffened, but she didn't cry out. Evelyn watched, her jaw tightening, but she did not move to stop him. He carried the girl to his horse, settling her gently across the saddle. She looked at him with silent suspicion, but her fingers clung to the horn as if she knew this was her only way out of the cold. Luke turned back for Evelyn. "Can you walk?" he asked. "I can manage," she said, though her voice wavered. Luke stepped closer, shrugging off his long duster coat. Without ceremony, he draped it around her shoulders, pulling the lapels together against the wind. "It's a long ride back. Keep it on." She hesitated, eyes darting from him to the horizon, as if calculating whether to trust him or take her chances with the empty trail. Finally, she drew the coat tighter and took a step toward the horse. Luke helped her mount behind the saddle, then swung up in front. The bay shifted under the added weight, but Luke's hand on the reins kept him steady. Evelyn's arms wrapped instinctively around Rose, her chin lowering until her face was half hidden in the child's hair. He turned the horse toward the trail leading back to his place. The wind whipped at them, pulling at the edges of the coat, but the fabric shielded them from the worst of it. Luke kept his eyes forward, but his mind circled the scene they were leaving behind. The overturned wagon, the scattered supplies, the stain on Evelyn's dress. Nothing about it sat right. As they rode, he adjusted his position subtly, angling his body to block the wind from striking Evelyn and Rose full in the face. He said nothing more, and neither did they. The only sound was the muffled thud of hooves on the hard-packed earth, and the distant cry of the storm settling deeper into the land. By the time the low hills that marked his property came into view, the sun was bleeding out behind the clouds, painting the world in dull copper. Luke knew the questions could wait. For now, getting them under a roof was the only thing that mattered. Luke guided his horse steadily up the gentle rise that marked the edge of his land, the familiar outline of his small log cabin framed against the darkening sky. The walls, weathered and worn, stood stubborn against the encroaching night, a quiet refuge from the vast emptiness of the Wyoming plains. The porch creaked under his boots as he led Evelyn and Rose inside, the heavy wooden door shutting behind them with a solid thud that seemed to seal away the wild world outside. Evelyn moved cautiously, her eyes flickering over every corner, every shadow, as if expecting something to leap out. Rose stayed close, clinging to her mother's side, silent and wide-eyed. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a flickering glow that softened the edges of the cabin's sparse furnishings. Luke filled a pot with water and set it over the flames, breaking the silence. "You need something to eat. Warm yourself up." Evelyn shook her head slowly. "Thank you, but I don't eat much these days." Her voice was steady but guarded, like a bird ready to fly at the slightest sound. Luke noticed how her hands trembled slightly as she wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. He set a rough chair near the fire and gestured for her to sit. Rose remained standing, watching Luke with quiet suspicion before she finally settled onto a ragged quilt folded on the floor. Luke sat across from them, his eyes lingering on Evelyn, trying to read the woman who held her child so fiercely, but said so little. After a while, Evelyn reached down and pulled a worn leather satchel from beneath her bundle. Luke's gaze caught on the shape within it, a small, heavy bulge beneath the cloth. He did not speak immediately, but watched as Evelyn carefully tied the satchel closed, fingers tightening with a strange mix of urgency and fear. That night, long after Evelyn and Rose had drifted into uneasy sleep, Luke's curiosity gnawed at him. The fire was low, the room thick with quiet. With a careful hand, he reached for the satchel, untied the knot just enough to peek inside. His fingers brushed against cold metal, the unmistakable weight of gold coins, their surfaces catching the firelight and throwing it back, like little stars. Luke sat back, jaw tightening. What game was this woman playing? Was she a desperate victim, or was there something more tangled beneath her calm exterior? The coins could mean freedom, but also danger. Blood money, perhaps. His mind wrestled with the possibilities, each one darker than the last. He hesitated, then gently folded the satchel back, tying the knot just as he'd found it. There was a line he wasn't willing to cross yet, not without knowing more. Respecting her privacy but holding on to his suspicion, Luke left the satchel where it lay, a silent question hanging between them in the quiet cabin. As the first light of dawn began to sift through the cracks in the cabin walls, Luke knew this was only the beginning. The silence of the night had not eased the tension in his chest, it had only sharpened it. Evelyn was more than just a woman down on her luck, and whatever secrets she carried might change everything. That afternoon, the sky was a steel blue, broken only by wisps of drifting clouds as Luke led Rose out toward the open fields. The little girl was stiff and hesitant at first, clutching the reins tightly with small white knuckles as the horse beneath her shifted nervously. Luke kept his voice soft and steady, coaxing her gently. "Easy now, Rose. You're doing fine, just like we practiced." From the cabin's window, Evelyn watched them. Her eyes, usually so guarded, softened as she saw her daughter's small face light up with tentative smiles. For a moment, the weight in her shoulders seemed lighter, the shadow behind her eyes receding. Luke helped Rose steady the horse at the trough near the old well, letting the bay drink deep while the girl's fingers relaxed around the reins. He wiped the sweat from the animal's flanks and took a moment to look around, scanning the horizon as if expecting something unseen. From a distant rise came the faint crunch of hooves on dry earth. 3 riders approaching with the practiced ease of men who knew these lands well. They wore dusty coats and wide hats pulled low, faces half hidden beneath scarves, eyes sharp and calculating as they drew closer. They slowed at the edge of the ranch, voices friendly, but their gazes sharp and piercing. "Morning, stranger," one called out, tipping his hat with a crooked grin. "Could you point us to the nearest town?" Luke's reply was measured and calm, voice steady. "Clearwater's the closest, about 10 miles east." He kept his eyes on them, reading every flicker of movement, every subtle gesture. Their glances flicked to the cabin, then to the scattered remains of a wagon hidden behind a copse of trees. The men's posture stiffened as they took in the scene. Something had brought them here with purpose, and Luke knew better than to trust their friendliness. When the riders moved off toward the east, Luke waited until their dust cloud shrank into the distance before quietly slipping to the stable. There, in the fading light, he shut the barn door with deliberate care, the heavy latch clicking into place sooner than usual. He moved toward the overturned wagon's wreckage, pulling brush and dirt over the broken wheel and scattered supplies, erasing any trace that might lead the men back to Evelyn and Rose. Luke paused for a moment, fingers brushing against the battered wood, before turning back to the cabin. Danger was closing in, silent but deadly, and the fragile peace he had offered was slipping away. He stepped inside just as the sunset turned the sky to fire, knowing the night ahead would demand more than quiet watchfulness. That night, the wind had died down to a restless whisper, but the cabin was anything but peaceful. Evelyn lay awake on the small cot by the fire, her eyes fixed on the dancing shadows cast by the flames. Rose was curled into her side, breathing shallow and uneven, but the child was still asleep, or so she thought. Suddenly, a faint noise stirred from outside, a rustling, a soft scrape against the wooden porch. At first, Evelyn thought it was just the wind, but then a sharper sound broke through, the slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps on dry earth, stepping lightly yet with purpose. Her breath caught in her throat. She sat up abruptly, clutching Rose tighter. Luke had been stirring near the hearth, his own eyes scanning the dark beyond the cabin walls. The moment he heard the faint disturbance, he grabbed his Colt revolver from the mantel, its cold steel a familiar comfort in the tense silence. Without a word, he slipped outside, eyes adjusting to the blackness. The night air was sharp and cold, stars pinpricks in the vast sky, but Luke's focus was on the ground. His boots crushed dry leaves and dirt as he moved toward the sound. But the porch, once empty when he left, was now silent and bare. The small bundle of clothes that should have been Rose was gone. A cold chill swept over Luke. His heart pounded as he dropped to his knees, eyes scanning for any sign, a footprint, a snagged thread. There, pressed faintly into the soft earth at the edge of the trees that ringed his property, were small, unmistakable footprints. Too small for any man but perfect for a child. Luke's hand brushed against something torn and fibrous. He picked up a scrap of fabric, blue and frayed at the edges. His breath hitched as he recognized the delicate cloth, part of the dress Rose had been wearing earlier that afternoon. Back inside, Evelyn had thrown off her blanket and was pacing, panic rising like a firestorm in her chest. When Luke returned, the tension was raw between them. "Rose is gone," he said quietly but with steel in his voice. Evelyn's face crumpled. For the first time since they met, the walls she had built around herself collapsed, and she fell to her knees clutching the cold floorboards. Tears came unbidden, hot and sharp. "You have to find her," she pleaded, voice breaking. "Please, Luke, you have to bring her back." Luke nodded once, heavy with the burden. He pulled his hat low and grabbed his rifle from the corner. "She's close," he said grimly. "Those footprints don't lie. Whoever took her wasn't careless." He thought back to the riders from earlier, their eyes searching, their questions about the wagon and the trail. He knew then. The band was back, hunting for the woman who carried something worth stealing. The gold, the freedom, the life she was trying to protect. They were all tied together like a noose. Luke's jaw clenched. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was a fight to keep what little they had left. He glanced at Evelyn, her face pale but determined beneath the tears. "We'll get her back," he promised, "no matter what it takes." With that, he strode toward the door, the heavy weight of the night settling on his shoulders. The wilderness beyond was dark and waiting, but Luke McGraw had never been a man to back down from what needed to be done. The chase had begun. The cabin was cold despite the fire's crackle, the shadows long and restless in the flickering light that danced across the worn wooden walls. Outside, the night pressed thick and heavy, the wind sighing softly against the eaves, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush and dust. Inside, the air was still, but for the quiet pop of burning logs and the low creak of settling timber. Evelyn sat at the battered wooden table, her hands trembling slightly as they wrapped around a tin cup of coffee long gone cold. The liquid inside offered little warmth, but the ritual of holding the cup seemed to steady her frail frame. Her eyes, rimmed red from sleepless hours, glistened with unshed tears that traced silent, dusty paths down her cheeks. The exhaustion in her gaze was a mask for the deeper turmoil buried beneath, a heart weighed down by fear and the ghosts of her past. Luke stood near the hearth, the amber glow painting his weathered face with stark, flickering shadows. The pipe resting between his fingers sent up thin tendrils of smoke that curled lazily toward the cabin's low ceiling, weaving through the stale air like a slow-moving ghost. He watched Evelyn quietly, his expression unreadable, but his posture tense, as though he too carried the weight of unspoken stories. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy with the tension of things left unsaid. For a long while neither spoke, their breaths mingling in the cold air, each moment hanging fragile, pregnant with possibility and dread. Finally, breaking the stillness, Evelyn's voice emerged, low and raw, trembling under the strain of confession. "I need to tell you something," she said, swallowing hard, as if the words were lodged in her throat. "The gold, it's mine, but not by choice." Her eyes flicked to the worn tabletop, then back up, searching Luke's face for any sign of judgment or disbelief. Luke's eyes narrowed, a flicker of suspicion crossing his face, but he remained silent, waiting patiently for her to speak her truth. "I didn't steal it from just anyone," Evelyn continued, her voice cracking with the weight of memory. "It belonged to my husband." Her knuckles whitened as she clenched the edge of the table, holding on as if it were the last anchor to steadiness. He was a man who dealt in whiskey and lies, smuggling liquor where the law forbade it. A cruel man, someone I spent years trying to escape from. Her lips pressed into a thin line, the past burning behind her eyes. When I found out he planned to sell me to pay off a debt, I took what I could, the gold he'd hidden away, and I ran. Her breath hitched as she blinked back the tears threatening to spill over. "The band you saw, they're his men, hunting me down, trying to force me back into his control." Luke took a slow, deliberate drag from his pipe, the smoke curling and twisting upward like the tangled truths now laid bare in the quiet cabin. For the first time, he truly saw the steel beneath Evelyn's wary glances, the way she guarded every word, every movement. This wasn't mere fear, it was survival, raw and relentless. He lowered the pipe, meeting her gaze across the table. His voice was steady, but softer than before. "You should have told me sooner." Evelyn shook her head, a sad, almost bitter smile flickering at the corners of her mouth. "I wanted to trust you. I wanted to believe you'd understand. But I was afraid you'd see me as a thief or worse, afraid you'd turn away when you learned the truth." Luke's gaze softened, but he said nothing that might deepen her pain or shame. Instead, he reached out quietly, pushing a steaming cup of coffee toward her with a gentle, unspoken kindness. "Drink this. You're going to need your strength." She accepted it, curling her hands around the cup as if it were a lifeline, the warmth seeping slowly into her chilled fingers. The fire's flicker cast their faces in soft, amber hues, illuminating the fragile honesty between them. Leaning back against the rough-hewn wall, Luke's eyes remained fixed on the dancing flames. The fire's glow was a fragile bulwark against the darkness, not just outside the cabin, but in the lives they both carried with them. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "I'm going after your daughter. Whatever it takes, I'll bring her home." Evelyn nodded, the first genuine flicker of hope sparking in her weary eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, voice barely audible, but full of gratitude and newfound trust. The cabin seemed to breathe with them in that moment, the walls holding their secrets and sorrows alike. No more shadows lurked between them now, only the promise of the fight ahead and the fragile bond forged in that humble, cold kitchen. Two wounded souls, bound not just by circumstance, but by a desperate need to protect what mattered most. The night stretched on, long and deep, and though the shadows whispered of danger still lurking just beyond the firelight, for one fleeting moment, the cabin felt like a sanctuary, an island of hope amid a sea of uncertainty. Luke sat on the creaking wooden bench inside his cabin, the dull light from the hearth casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. Before him lay his Colt revolver, the weapon he had not touched in years. The metal was tarnished and dull, scarred by time and neglect. His hands, steadied despite the years and battles behind him, worked methodically, wiping away the dust, oiling the mechanism, checking the chamber and the hammer with care. Each movement was deliberate, a ritual of preparation and remembrance. He reached for the leather gun belt hanging from a peg on the wall, the one he had long since abandoned. The weight of it felt unfamiliar in his hands, yet there was a grim comfort in the familiar heft of the leather and steel. Luke buckled it around his waist, the sound of the strap tightening echoing like a summons to a part of himself he had tried to leave behind. His mind drifted back to a darker time, years before, when his reputation as a marksman had been unmatched across the frontier. The story was well known. Luke McGraw, the fastest hand in Wyoming, a man who never missed. But the price of that reputation was heavy. He remembered the day vividly. A dusty street in a nameless town, the sun beating down as two men faced off in a duel that had nothing to do with honor and everything to do with grudges. Luke had drawn his gun faster than the eye could follow, but in a cruel twist of fate, the bullet meant for an enemy had struck his closest friend instead. The man's blood had darkened the dirt, and the sound of his final breath had shattered Luke's soul. That day, Luke had hung up his guns, vowing never to kill again, not even in self-defense. A soft knock at the door pulled him back to the present. Evelyn stood there, worry etched on her face. "I want to come with you," she said quietly. "We face this together." Luke shook his head, firm but gentle. "No, Evelyn. This is my fight. I won't risk you or Rose. You've been through enough already." Her eyes searched his, the pain and determination mingling. She nodded slowly, though the unspoken fear of what lay ahead hung heavy between them. He grabbed his wide-brimmed hat and slung the rifle over his shoulder. Stepping outside, the night air was cool against his face. Stars scattered like spilled diamonds across the velvet sky. The trail ahead was dark and uncertain, but Luke's resolve burned, steady and bright. Following the faint impressions in the soft earth, he tracked the bandit's path across the open prairie. The wind whispered through the tall grasses, carrying the scent of sage and pine. The moon cast pale silver light on the landscape, illuminating the narrow cuts where the horses had pressed onward. Luke's eyes scanned every detail, the broken twig here, a hoof print there, piecing together the route through the rolling hills and into the shadowed canyons beyond. Each step was a step closer to Rose, to the chance of redemption, and to the ghosts he had tried to bury. The rugged terrain was unforgiving. Rocky outcroppings jutted from the earth, and narrow ledges threatened to spill him into the depths below. But Luke moved with the sure-footedness of a man who had spent his life chasing shadows and danger. The past whispered behind him, but he pressed forward, the old fire igniting once more in his veins. As dawn crept over the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, Luke paused at the edge of a narrow gorge. Below, smoke curled faintly into the sky from a distant campfire. His heart quickened. The rescue was no longer a question of if, but when. Luke's hand tightened around the rifle. This was the moment. The reckoning with the past. the chance to save a little girl and the woman who had stolen his reluctant sympathy. The gunslinger had returned, ready to face what he had long tried to forget. Luke crouched low in the shadows just beyond the riverbank, the soft rush of water blending with the distant crackle of a campfire flickering against the night. The old warehouse loomed ahead, its timbers gray and weathered, half swallowed by thick weeds and wild vines that twisted up its sides. The building was a forgotten relic, standing stubbornly on the muddy shore, its broken windows like empty eyes watching the dark. Luke kept himself hidden in the brush, muscles taut, eyes narrowed as he spotted the flickering glow leaking through the warped slats of the rotting walls. From inside, coarse and impatient voices floated out, low murmurs filled with tension and threat. Steeling himself against the cold night air, Luke crept forward, each step measured and silent. The heavy scent of smoke, sweat, and old decay mingled in the air, a smell of abandonment and menace that pressed close to his senses. Through a narrow crack in the warped wood, his eyes caught sight of a small figure, Rose. The child's wrists were bound tightly with rough rope, her slender arms stretched above her head, but thankfully there were no visible bruises or cuts. Her wide eyes searched the gloom, flickering between fear and hope, her breath coming in soft, uneven gasps. Luke's breath hitched, a wave of relief flooding through him. But there was no time for softness now. The danger was real and immediate. His heart hammered fiercely, adrenaline sharpening every sense. He risked a glance further inside and heard the unmistakable voice of a man, gruff, cold, and commanding. The figure stepped into the circle of firelight, revealing a rugged man whose hard lines were etched deep by years of hardship and violence. A long scar cut across his left cheek, twisting his face into a permanent snarl. His eyes, sharp and calculating, locked onto the girl like a predator, sizing up its prey. It was Tom Brackett. Luke's mind flashed back to that day years ago, the ambush on a narrow mountain pass, the deafening roar of gunfire, the searing pain when his bullet struck the man he never wanted to harm. Tom had saved his life then, dragging him from the jaws of death. They had sworn never to face each other with weapons drawn again, bound by an uneasy truce forged in blood. But tonight, the past and present collided. They stood as enemies, separated by a fragile line of loyalty and survival. Slowly and carefully, Luke slid his hand to the rifle slung over his shoulder, his fingers wrapped around the familiar wood and steel, steady as he took aim through a narrow gap in the wall. His sights locked on Tom, the man holding the life of a child in his grasp. The sharp crack of the rifle shattered the night's stillness. Tom's hand jerked violently as the bullet struck his wrist with a sickening crack. The revolver he had wielded clattered onto the wooden floorboards. Surprise and pain flickered across his face as he cradled the injured hand, his eyes wide in shock. Luke stepped from the shadows, his rifle trained steadily on the man. His voice was low, calm, but carried the iron edge of finality. "Drop it, this ends tonight." Tom's gaze met Luke's, and for a brief, fragile moment the old camaraderie sparked between them, a reminder of shared battles and debts unpaid. But the hard edge of survival soon hardened Tom's expression. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his free hands in surrender, a silent truce in the face of inevitability. Luke kept his rifle leveled, but his voice softened, the bitterness of years tempered by a reluctant mercy. "I'm giving you a chance. Stay away from Evelyn and that girl, or next time, I won't miss." Tom nodded slowly, the weight of the warning settling between them like the curling smoke rising from the dying fire. For a long moment the two men regarded one another, warriors caught between the ghosts of their past and the fragile duty of the present. Without another word, Luke stepped forward, drawing a sharp knife from his belt. With steady hands, he cut through the ropes binding Rose's wrists. The girl blinked up at him, trembling but safe. Luke gathered her gently into his arms, whispering soft reassurances as she clung tightly to him. Turning back to Tom, Luke's voice held a final edge of warning. "Go. Stay out of our way." Tom hesitated, then slowly backed into the shadows, retreating into the dark night and leaving the warehouse and its ghosts behind. Luke did not watch him leave. His focus was on Rose, on the fragile promise of a future they might still claim together. Around them, the night held its breath, the silence of victory not won by bloodshed, but by the hard mercy of a man who chose to break the cycle of violence for the sake of a little girl and the woman who had fought beside her. Together they stepped out from the shadows into the cold dawn, ready to face whatever lay beyond with a new resolve quietly burning in their hearts. Luke rode slowly back toward the cabin, the dawn's pale light spilling over the rolling plains. In his arms, Rose stirred awake, blinking sleep from wide, trusting eyes. Her small fingers curled tightly around his coat as he approached the familiar silhouette of the cabin where Evelyn waited, pacing anxiously by the door. As Luke dismounted, he gently lowered Rose into Evelyn's outstretched arms. Relief flooded the woman's face, tears spilling down as she held her daughter close, whispering words of comfort and gratitude. "Thank you," Evelyn said softly, looking up at Luke with a mixture of hope and exhaustion. Luke offered a tired but genuine smile. "The road's still long," he said quietly, "but no one gets left behind anymore." The three stood for a moment, bound by a fragile promise beneath the vast western sky. Then, without a word, they mounted their horses and rode westward, the sun dipping low and painting the horizon in blazing hues of orange and red. Dust kicked up behind them, swirling like the ghosts of the past, but ahead lay the promise of new beginnings. Luke positioned Rose in front of him on his saddle, her small hands clutching the horn with wonder and trust. He carefully adjusted the wide-brimmed hat that had slipped over her eyes, tilting it just so to shield her from the fading sun. It was a simple gesture, but one that spoke volumes. A man claiming the fragile beginnings of family, of protection, and of love. 2 years later, that rugged patch of Wyoming land had changed. The cabin stood stronger, framed by a sturdy fence, and the garden outside bloomed with vegetables and wildflowers, nurtured by Evelyn's careful hands. Rose grew into a bright, spirited child, her laughter ringing clear across the fields as she learned to ride and explore under Luke's watchful eye. The scars of the past had not vanished, but together they had built a home filled with quiet joys and steady companionship. Luke's once lonely life had been transformed by the bond forged in hardship and hope. In the evenings, the three would sit by the fire, sharing stories beneath a sky full of stars, the silence between them comfortable and filled with unspoken love. This was a life born from dust and danger, a testament to survival and the unexpected grace of a second chance. As the sun set over their small sanctuary, the future stretched wide and open before them. A new frontier, not just of land, but of hearts finally finding rest. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the rugged heart of the American frontier, where love, courage, and second chances bloom even in the harshest of lands. Luke, Evelyn, and little Rose remind us that no matter how deep the scars or how wild the trail, family and hope can lead us home. If you were moved by their story, don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Love Stories, your destination for unforgettable romances, untamed passions, and the enduring spirit of the Old West. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a tale, where hearts beat stronger than bullets and love rides beyond every frontier. Stay with us for more stories that echo across time and dust, where every whisper carries the promise of a new beginning. Subscribe now and join the ride, where bullets missed, but hearts didn't.